The stars looked different through the viewport of the USS Liberty as Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge. He had seen these same stars for 15 years, but today they felt cold and distant. The message from Earth Command sat on his desk. Its words burned into his memory even though he had read it only once. Ambassador Lisa Carter walked onto the bridge, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 days in heated negotiations. She carried a datapad in her hands, but Jake could see from her expression that the news was not good. The council had made their decision, and it was final. "Captain, we need to prepare for departure," Lisa said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of defeat, but also something else that Jake recognized as relief. After months of hostile meetings and barely concealed insults from the other species, perhaps leaving was not such a terrible thing. The Galactic Council had voted them out by a massive margin. 847 species had voted to remove humanity from the Council, while only 3 had supported them. The Kepler Coalition, the Centauri Republic, and the Free Traders Guild had stood by humanity, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming majority who wanted humans. Gone. Jake activated the ship's communication system and called his senior staff to the bridge. Chief Engineer Danny Rodriguez arrived first. Wiping grease from his hands with a cloth, Dr. Amy Watson followed, carrying her ever-present tablet full of scientific data. Communications Officer Pete Collins came last, looking puzzled by the sudden meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, "we have received our orders from Admiral Susan Clark at Earth Command. All human personnel, vessels, and installations are to withdraw from Council space immediately. No protests, no appeals, no dramatic speeches. We leave quietly and completely." Danny Rodriguez frowned and looked at his captain. "What about all the technology we've installed here? The fusion reactors, the communication arrays, the medical systems? Half the stations in this sector run on human engineering?" Watson looked up from her tablet. "That's actually an interesting point. Danny, most of our technology requires regular authentication from Earth-based quantum processors. Without those updates, the systems will start shutting down in about 72 hours. Lisa Carter sat down heavily in her chair. The council leaders made it very clear that they don't want anything to do with humans anymore. Prime Minister Veltar from the Zephyrian Empire called us emotionally unstable and dangerously unpredictable. Chancellor Krexelon from the Hegemony said we were too aggressive for civilized space. Jake felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Getting emotional now would only prove their point. Instead, he turned to Pete Collins. "Send a message to all human facilities in Council space. Complete withdrawal within 48 hours. All personnel, all equipment, all data. We take everything with us." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Human cargo ships began arriving at every station and colony, loading equipment and personnel with efficient speed. Jake watched the process from his bridge, amazed at how quickly 15 years of human presence could be packed away and removed. Dr. Watson approached him with a concerned expression. "Captain, I've been reviewing the technology integration reports. The situation is more complex than I initially thought. Our quantum processors don't just authenticate our own systems. They've become integral to the basic infrastructure of dozens of worlds." She showed him her tablet screen, which displayed a complex network diagram. "Look at this. The communication array at Nexus Station uses our quantum entanglement technology for faster-than-light messaging. The fusion reactors on Kepler 442b require our control systems to maintain stable reactions. The medical nanobots in hospitals across 17 star systems need daily updates from our biological research databases." Jake studied the information carefully. What happens when our authentication codes stop working? Best case scenario, the systems switch to backup modes that are much less efficient. Worst case, they shut down completely to prevent dangerous failures, Amy replied. The medical nanobots, for example, will dissolve harmlessly rather than risk harming patients, but that means thousands of people who depend on them for life support will be in serious trouble. Danny Rodriguez had been listening to their conversation. "Captain, I need to tell you something. When we installed these systems, the council representatives always insisted on having their own technicians involved. They wanted to learn how everything worked so they could maintain it themselves. And? Jake prompted. They never really understood it, Danny admitted. Oh, they could follow the basic maintenance procedures we taught them, but the underlying quantum mechanics and biological interfaces were way beyond their comprehension. I always figured that was fine because we'd be around to help them, Lisa Carter joined their conversation. The irony is that they're voting us out partly because they think we're too dependent on our technology and not civilized enough for their advanced society. But their advanced society has been running on human technology for over a decade. Jake made a decision. Send a final message to the council leadership. Inform them that all human design systems will require authentication updates within 72 hours. Offer to provide technical support and training for their personnel to maintain the systems independently. Pete Collins looked surprised. Sir, are you sure that's wise? After the way they've treated us? It's the right thing to do, Jake replied firmly. We don't abandon people to die just because they've hurt our feelings. That's probably what separates US from them. The message was sent, but the response came back within an hour. Prime Minister Veltar's reply was brief and cold. The council would not accept any further assistance from humanity. They were confident that their own scientists could manage any technical challenges that might arise. Dr. Watson shook her head. As she read the response, their confidence is misplaced. Some of these systems took our best engineers years to develop. The quantum encryption alone involves principles that most council species haven't even discovered yet. As the USS Liberty prepared to leave Nexus Station for the final time, Jake stood on the observation deck watching the massive structure slowly rotate in space. Thousands of beings from hundreds of different worlds lived and worked there, all of them depending on technology that humanity had freely shared. Danny Rodriguez joined him at the viewport. It feels wrong leaving them like this. We're not leaving them, Jake corrected. They're sending us away. There's a difference. The final cargo ship reported that all human personnel and equipment had been evacuated from council space. Jake gave the order to depart, and the USS Liberty turned away from Nexus Station for the last time. As they jumped to faster-than-light travel, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was not really an ending. The council had made their choice, but choices always had consequences. In 72 hours, those consequences would begin to make themselves known. Dr. Watson was already working on contingency plans, and Jake suspected they would be needed sooner rather than later. Humanity had left quietly and with dignity, taking their technology and expertise with them. Now they would wait and see what happened next. 3 days after the last human ship disappeared from council space, Communications Officer Zakara noticed the first warning light on his control panel at Nexus Station. The Altarian had been monitoring the long-range communication array for over 8 years, and he had never seen this particular amber indicator before. Zakara called his supervisor, but she was equally puzzled by the warning message that appeared on their screens. The text was written in human script, which neither of them could read fluently. They had always relied on the automatic translation systems, but those seemed to be experiencing problems as well. On the industrial world of Kepler 442b, Plant Supervisor Dexori was having a much worse day. The massive fusion reactors that powered the planet's manufacturing centers had been displaying error messages since early morning. The warnings were appearing more frequently now, and some of the automated systems were beginning to shut down non-essential operations. Dexori contacted the Zephyrian engineers who had been assigned to oversee the human-designed equipment after the evacuation. They arrived at the plant looking confident and professional, carrying their advanced scanning devices and technical manuals. However, their confidence quickly faded when they saw the complexity of the reactor control systems. These quantum processing units are far more sophisticated than we anticipated, admitted Chief Engineer Knox Barra as he stared at the incomprehensible displays. The human technicians made it look so simple when they were here. Meanwhile, in the capital city of the Zephyrian Empire, Prime Minister Veltar was receiving his daily briefing from the Science Ministry. Director Naksemi assured him that the minor, technical difficulties being reported throughout Council space were completely normal and expected. Our scientists have been studying human technology for over a decade, Prime Minister, Director Naksemi said with confidence. We understand their systems better than they realize. Give us a few weeks, and we will have everything running more efficiently than when the humans were managing it. Prime Minister Veltar nodded approvingly. Excellent. The Council made the right decision in removing humanity from our organization. Their emotional instability and aggressive tendencies were becoming a serious problem for galactic peace. However, the problems were not remaining minor as Director Naksemi had predicted. On the medical research station orbiting Rigel, Dr. Termini was growing increasingly worried about the human-designed medical nanobots that kept thousands of patients alive across the galaxy. The tiny machines required daily updates from quantum processors to maintain their programming and ensure they continued to function safely. Dr. Termini had tried contacting the Zephyrian Science Ministry for assistance, but they had dismissed his concerns. They assured him that their own nanotechnology experts would solve any problems that arose. Unfortunately, none of those experts had arrived yet, and the nanobots were beginning to display warning messages that Dr. Termini could not understand. Back at Nexus Station, the communication problems were getting worse. Zakara watched helplessly as one by one, the quantum entanglement communicators that allowed instant communication across the galaxy began experiencing cascade failures. Without these systems, it would take weeks or months for messages to travel between distant star systems. Using conventional technology, the Trade Federation was the first organization to feel the real impact of the communication breakdown. Captain Rexvin of the merchant vessel Far Horizon found himself stranded in deep space when his navigation updates failed to arrive from the central traffic control system. Without current information about shipping lanes and hazard warnings, he had no choice but to shut down his faster-than-light drive and wait for help. Similar situations were developing throughout Council space as the sophisticated network of human-designed systems began to fail. The quantum processors that managed everything from air traffic control to waste processing were starting to shut down their authentication protocols. On the military world of Sigma Draconis, General Caxter of the Hegemony Forces was growing impatient with the technical delays affecting his communication systems. As Chancellor Krexelon's most trusted commander, he had little patience for excuses from civilian technicians. I don't care how complicated the human technology is, General Caxter growled at the trembling engineer before him. You will make these systems work, or I will find someone who can. The engineer, a nervous hegemony scientist named Kexmyra, had been trying to explain that the human quantum encryption was beyond anything their military scientists had encountered. The security protocols were layered so deeply into the system architecture that attempting to bypass them might cause even more serious failures back on Earth. President Helen Murphy was receiving regular intelligence reports about the developing situation in Council space. Colonel Frank Weber, head of Earth Intelligence, had maintained a network of monitoring stations along the border that allowed them to track Council communications and activities. The situation is worse than we expected, Madam President, Colonel Weber reported during their morning briefing. Their communication networks are failing faster than Dr. Park predicted. Some star systems have been completely cut off from the central government. Dr. Kevin Park, Earth's leading expert on quantum computing, had been monitoring the authentication failures from his laboratory. The cascade effect is accelerating because they keep trying to override the security protocols instead of working with them. Every failed attempt triggers additional protective measures. President Murphy studied the reports carefully. Have they made any attempt to contact us for technical assistance? None whatsoever, Colonel Weber confirmed. Our intelligence suggests that Prime Minister Veltar and Chancellor Krexelon are convinced their own scientists can solve the problems without human help. Admiral Susan Clark, who had been coordinating the human fleet movements from Alpha Centauri, joined the conversation via secure communication. Madam President, we're receiving distress signals from some of our former allies. The Kepler Coalition has requested permission to send a diplomatic mission to discuss technical cooperation. What about the Centauri Republic? President Murphy asked. They're in a difficult position, Admiral Clark replied. Their own territory includes several systems that depend heavily on human medical technology. They're trying to maintain neutrality, while quietly preparing for potential humanitarian crises. Dr. Park pulled up a holographic display showing the predicted failure timeline. Based on our models, the medical systems will start failing within the next 24 hours. The fusion reactors will go into emergency shutdown mode shortly after that. If they don't get help soon, we're looking at a galactic humanitarian crisis. President Murphy made a decision that would define humanity's response to the unfolding situation. Colonel Weber, I want our rescue fleets positioned at the borders of Council space, ready for immediate humanitarian assistance if requested. Admiral Clark, coordinate with our allies but make no moves into Council territory without explicit authorization. What about unsolicited assistance? Dr. Park asked. We wait, President Murphy said firmly. They voted us out with overwhelming numbers. They assured us they could manage without human help. We gave them fair warning about the authentication requirements. Now we see if their pride is worth more than their people's lives. As the second day after the human departure ended, the first fusion reactor on Kepler 442b went into emergency shutdown mode. 1 week after the humans had left Council space, the situation had become a nightmare that no one wanted to admit was happening. On Nexus Station, Emergency Coordinator Lex Vanna stared at her control boards as red warning lights flashed across every major system. The station that housed the central government of the galaxy was slowly dying. The communication breakdown had spread like a disease through the quantum network. Star systems that had enjoyed instant contact with each other for decades were now isolated islands in space. Trade ships drifted helplessly between systems, unable to receive navigation updates or emergency assistance. Calls. Dr. Termini at the medical station orbiting Rigel had not slept for 3 days. The human-designed medical nanobots that kept thousands of patients alive across 17 star systems were failing one by one. Each day brought new reports of life support systems shutting down as the tiny machines dissolved themselves rather than risk harming their patients. We need help, Dr. Termini pleaded during his daily communication with the Zephyrian Science Ministry. These patients will die without the nanobots. I don't care about politics or pride. People are going to die. Director Noxemi's response was the same as always. Our own medical technology experts are working on the problem. We will have a solution soon. The Council will not bow to human technological dependence. But Dr. Termini knew the truth that Director Noxemi refused to accept. The human medical nanobots were based on principles that the Council's most advanced scientists barely understood. The tiny machines used quantum processing to make millions of calculations per second, adjusting their behavior based on real-time biological data that changed constantly. On the industrial world of Kepler 442b, the situation had moved beyond critical. Half of the fusion reactors had shut down completely, and the remaining ones were operating at barely 20% capacity. Plant Supervisor Dexuri watched his manufacturing centers go dark one by one as power became too scarce to maintain normal operations. The Zephyrian engineers had tried everything they could think of to restart the failed reactors. They had attempted to bypass the human control systems, override the safety protocols, and even physically disconnect the quantum processors. Every attempt had only made the situation worse, triggering additional security measures that further limited the reactor's output. We should contact the humans, suggested Junior Engineer Vex Mera during their daily crisis meeting. They designed these systems, they would know how to fix them. Chief Engineer Noxbara's response was sharp and immediate. Absolutely not. Prime Minister Veltar has made it clear that we do not negotiate with the humans. They are no longer part of the Council, and we will solve this problem ourselves. Meanwhile, General Caxter of the Hegemony Forces was facing his own growing crisis. The military communication systems that connected his fleets across dozens of star systems were failing at an alarming rate. Ships that should have been coordinating complex patrol patterns were now operating blindly, unable to share information about potential threats or coordinate their movements. General Caxter had ordered his best military scientists to find a solution, but their attempts to crack the human quantum encryption had been completely unsuccessful. The security systems seemed to anticipate every approach they tried, adapting and strengthening their defenses with each failed attack. "Sir," reported his chief technician Kekstova, "we've identified what appears to be an emergency override protocol in the human systems. If we can activate it, we might be able to bypass all the authentication requirements." General Caxter studied the data on his screen. "What are the risks?" "Unknown, sir. The protocol is heavily encrypted, and we can't determine what it actually does without activating it. But our analysis suggests it might give us complete control over the human technology." The general considered this information carefully. The hegemony prided itself on military strength and technological superiority. The idea that they were being defeated by human computer programs was unacceptable on Earth. The monitoring stations were tracking every failure and every desperate attempt by Council scientists to solve their growing problems. Dr. Kevin Park watched the data streams with a mixture of professional interest and growing concern for the innocent people who were suffering. "They're making it worse," Dr. Park explained to President Helen Murphy during their emergency briefing. "Every time they try to force their way through our security systems, they trigger additional protective protocols. The quantum processors are designed to assume that unauthorized access attempts represent hostile action." Colonel Frank Weber added his own intelligence reports to the briefing. "Our sources indicate that several star systems are experiencing complete infrastructure collapse. The Altarian Federation has lost contact with 4 of their outer colonies. The medical emergency on Rigel is spreading to other systems as patients dependent on nanotechnology lose life support." Admiral Susan Clark joined the conversation from her flagship in the Alpha Centauri system. "Madam President, we're receiving urgent communications from the Kepler Coalition and the Centauri Republic. They're requesting immediate humanitarian assistance for their populations who depend on human medical technology." President Murphy faced the most difficult decision of her career. The Council had voted humanity out by an overwhelming margin, showing contempt for human contributions to galactic civilization. But innocent people were dying while their leaders refused to ask for help. "What's our legal position if we provide assistance to our former allies?" President Murphy asked. "The Kepler Coalition and Centauri Republic maintain their support for humanity," Colonel Weber replied. "They're not technically part of the Council vote since they opposed it. We could justify humanitarian assistance to them without violating our withdrawal agreement." Dr. Park pulled up a new display showing the cascade failure timeline. "Madam President, based on the current rate of system failures, we're approaching a critical point. Within the next 48 hours, life support systems throughout Council space will begin failing. We're not talking about inconvenience anymore. We're talking about massive loss of life." Admiral Clark's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime in military service. "Madam President, our rescue fleets are positioned and ready. We can have medical ships at Rigel within 6 hours and emergency power supplies to critical systems within 12 hours. President Murphy stood and walked to the window of her office, looking out at the lights of the city below. Every one of those lights represented people who trusted her to make the right decisions. But what was the right decision when pride and politics were preventing her from saving lives? "Open a secure channel to Prime Minister Veltar," President Murphy decided. "It's time to make one final offer." The communication was established within minutes, but Prime Minister Veltar's response was immediate and final. The Council would accept no assistance from humanity under any circumstances. They would solve their own problems with their own technology and their own scientists. As the communication ended, Dr. Park's monitoring systems detected something new and alarming. Someone in Council space had just activated what appeared to be an experimental override protocol in the human systems. The quantum signatures were unlike anything they had seen before. "Madam President," Dr. Park said quietly, Someone just pressed the wrong button. Director Naksemi stood in the central laboratory of the Zephyrian Science Ministry, watching her team of scientists work frantically on what they believed would be their salvation. Chief Scientist Lexandra had discovered what appeared to be a master override protocol buried deep within the human quantum processing systems. Are you certain this will work? Director Naksemi asked for the third time in 10 minutes. The pressure from Prime Minister Veltar was becoming unbearable as reports of system failures poured in from across the galaxy. Lexandra nodded confidently as she prepared the activation sequence. Our analysis shows this protocol will bypass all authentication requirements and give us complete control over the human technology. We'll be able to restore communications, restart the fusion reactors, and reactivate the medical systems within hours. What Lexandra did not understand was that she was looking at Protocol Omega, a military-grade security system designed by human engineers for the most extreme circumstances. The protocol had only one purpose: to prevent human technology from being used by hostile forces during wartime by completely destroying all quantum processing capabilities. Director Naksemi gave the final authorization, and Lexandra initiated the override sequence. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then across the galaxy, every piece of human technology began to execute the most comprehensive self-destruction sequence ever designed on Nexus Station. Emergency Coordinator Lex Vanna watched in horror as every system display in the control center went dark simultaneously. The fusion reactors that powered the massive station didn't just shut down, they purged their quantum control matrices completely. The artificial gravity generator stopped working, sending loose objects floating through the corridors. Emergency power systems switched to backup mode, but they were designed to last only 48 hours. Dr. Termini, at the medical station orbiting Rigel, felt his heart break as he watched thousands of medical nanobots dissolve harmlessly but completely throughout the galaxy. The patients who depended on these tiny machines for life support were now facing death within hours. The quantum processors that had maintained the nanobots' complex programming deleted themselves so thoroughly that no trace of the original code remained. On Kepler 442b, Plant Supervisor Dexuri stared in disbelief as the remaining fusion reactors entered complete shutdown mode. The quantum control systems that had managed the delicate balance of nuclear fusion for over a decade erased themselves entirely. Without power, the planet's manufacturing centers went dark. Life support systems switched to emergency mode, and millions of inhabitants found themselves facing a crisis unlike anything in their civilization's history. The faster-than-light communication network that had connected the galaxy for decades vanished in minutes. The quantum entanglement matrices that allowed instant communication across vast distances deleted their encryption keys and severed their connections permanently. Star systems that had been part of a unified galactic civilization suddenly found themselves isolated and alone. General Caxter of the Hegemony forces realized immediately that his military had just suffered the worst defeat in their history without firing a single shot. His fleets were scattered across dozens of star systems with no way to coordinate their movements or share intelligence. The sophisticated weapons systems that depended on human quantum processing became useless metal sculptures floating in space. On Earth, the emergency monitoring stations erupted in alarms as Dr. Kevin Park watched the signature of Protocol Omega spread across the galaxy like a wave of destruction. Every human-designed system was executing the same self-destruction sequence simultaneously, creating a quantum cascade that would be impossible to reverse. "Dear God," Dr. Park whispered as he understood what had happened. "They activated Protocol Omega. Someone thought it was an override, but it's actually our most extreme security protocol." President Helen Murphy arrived in the command center within minutes of the first alarms. "Dr. Park, I need to understand what we're looking at." "Madam President, Protocol Omega was designed for the worst-case scenario during wartime. If human technology was about to fall into enemy hands, This protocol would completely destroy all quantum processing capabilities to prevent hostile use. It's irreversible. Colonel Frank Weber was coordinating with intelligence assets throughout the border regions. Madam President, we're receiving emergency transmissions from across Council space. Life support failures, power grid collapses, communication blackouts. The Altarian Federation is reporting that their homeworld has less than 24 hours of emergency power remaining. Admiral Susan Clark's voice came through the communication system from her flagship. Madam President, the Kepler Coalition has sent an urgent request for immediate humanitarian assistance. Their medical facilities are experiencing complete system failures. The Centauri Republic is reporting similar emergencies. The scale of the disaster was becoming clear as reports continued to arrive. The galactic civilization that had existed for thousands of years was collapsing in real time. Planets that had supported billions of inhabitants were facing the prospect of life support failure. Medical facilities throughout the galaxy were watching their patients die as human-designed. Systems destroyed themselves. General Larry Thompson at Space Command provided the military assessment. Madam President, our intelligence indicates that several Council military forces are completely paralyzed. Their ships can't coordinate movements, their weapon systems are offline, and their communication networks are down. From a strategic perspective, they're completely helpless. But President Murphy was not thinking about strategic advantages. She was thinking about the innocent people who were suffering because their leaders had been too proud to ask for help. The Council had voted humanity out of their organization, but the people dying in hospitals and trapped on failing space stations had not made that decision. How long do we have before the situation becomes irreversible? President Murphy asked Dr. Park consulted his displays showing the cascade failure timeline. For the medical emergencies, we have hours at most. For the power grid failures, maybe a day or two before backup systems are exhausted. For the communication networks, the damage is already permanent. It would take years to rebuild those systems from scratch. Admiral Clark's next report confirmed what everyone in the room already suspected. Madam President, we're receiving desperate communications from species throughout Council space. The Rigel Medical Collective states that patients are dying. The industrial worlds are reporting complete infrastructure collapse. Even the Zephyrian Empire has sent an encrypted message requesting immediate assistance. President Murphy made the decision that would define humanity's place in galactic history. Admiral Clark, authorize Operation Samaritan immediately. I want our rescue fleets moving into Council space within the hour. Medical ships to Rigel, emergency power supplies to critical facilities, and engineering teams to restore basic life support wherever needed. Madam President, the Council leadership has not officially requested assistance, Colonel Weber pointed out. The Council leadership activated Protocol Omega, President Murphy replied firmly. Their pride and arrogance have created a humanitarian disaster that threatens every living being in their space. We're not going to let innocent people die while their leaders debate politics. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The species that had voted humanity out of the galactic community for being too emotional and unpredictable were now completely dependent on human compassion for their survival. As the first human rescue ships jumped to faster-than-light travel toward Council space, Dr. Park reflected on what had just happened. The Council had pressed the wrong button, but humanity was about to show them what the right response looked like. The first human rescue ship to arrive at Nexus Station was the USS Constitution, commanded by Captain Ryan Bell. As his vessel approached the massive structure that housed the galactic government, he could see that the situation was even worse than their intelligence reports had indicated. Emergency lights flickered weakly throughout the station, and debris from failed systems drifted in the space around it. Emergency Coordinator Lex Vanna watched through the viewport as the human ship approached. She had spent her entire career believing that humans were dangerous and unpredictable, but now she found herself hoping desperately that they would save her people. The station's life support systems had less than 12 hours of power remaining. Captain Bell opened a communication channel to the station. Nexus Station, this is Captain Ryan Bell of the USS Constitution. We're here to provide emergency assistance. Please direct us to your most critical systems. Lex Vanna hesitated for only a moment before responding. Pride and politics seemed foolish when faced with the prospect of everyone on the station suffocating. Captain Bell, our main power systems have failed completely. We're running on emergency backup power that will not last much longer. Within hours, human engineering teams were working throughout Nexus Station, installing portable fusion reactors and emergency life support systems. The humans worked with quiet efficiency, not mentioning the political situation that had led to this crisis. They simply focused on saving lives. At the medical station orbiting Rigel, Dr. Termini watched with amazement as human medical ships arrived carrying both doctors and advanced equipment. Dr. Amy Watson led a team of human physicians who immediately began working to replace the failed nanotechnology with temporary but effective alternatives. We can't recreate the nanobots quickly enough, Dr. Watson explained to Dr. Termini, but we can provide life support systems that will keep your patients stable while we develop a permanent solution. The human doctors worked alongside their alien colleagues without any trace of resentment or superiority. They shared their knowledge freely, explained their procedures patiently, and treated every patient with the same care they would give their own people. On Kepler 442b, Chief Engineer Danny Rodriguez arrived with a fleet of human technical ships, carrying portable power generators and fusion reactor components. Plant Supervisor Dexori met them at the landing pad, expecting to be lectured about the Council's treatment of humanity. Instead, Danny simply asked, "Where do you need power most urgently?" The human engineering teams worked around the clock to restore basic infrastructure to the planet. They installed temporary fusion reactors that could operate independently of the destroyed quantum processing systems. More importantly, they trained local technicians on maintaining the new equipment so the planet would not be dependent on human assistance in the future. Throughout Council space, similar scenes played out as human rescue fleets arrived at every location where lives were at stake. The species that had voted to remove humanity from the galactic community watched in wonder as their former enemies risked their own safety to provide assistance. On Earth, President Helen Murphy monitored the rescue operations from the command center. Reports arrived hourly showing the progress being made across the galaxy. The immediate crisis was being contained, but the political implications were enormous. "Madam President," Colonel Frank Weber reported, "we're receiving communications from governments throughout Council space. The Kepler Coalition and Centauri Republic have officially requested bilateral treaties with Earth. Even some of the species that voted against us are privately asking about technology sharing agreements." The most significant communication came from Prime Minister Veltar of the Zephyrian Empire. For the first time since the crisis began, he was requesting a direct conversation with President Murphy. The communication was established within the hour. Prime Minister Veltar appeared on the screen looking tired and humbled. "President Murphy, I must formally request humanitarian assistance from humanity. Our people are suffering and we cannot solve this crisis without your help." President Murphy's response was measured and diplomatic. "Prime Minister Veltar, our rescue teams are already providing assistance wherever lives are at stake. We don't require formal requests to save people in danger. But we do require formal requests for anything more permanent," she continued. "Humanity will provide all necessary aid to prevent loss of life, but our return to the galactic community must be on new terms." The negotiations that followed were unlike any in galactic history. Ambassador Lisa Carter, who had been so recently expelled from the council chambers, now found herself in the position of negotiating humanity's return from a position of absolute strength. Every species in the galaxy had just learned that they could not survive without human technology and expertise. However, humanity's demands were not about revenge or dominance. Instead, they focused on creating a more just and equitable galactic society. Ambassador Carter presented three core requirements for humanity's return to the Council. First, equal representation for all species regardless of their age or level of technological development. the old system that gave more votes to older civilizations, would be replaced with a structure that protected the rights of younger species. Second, establishment of a Galactic Ethics Committee with human participation to prevent the exploitation of smaller or less advanced species. The committee would have the authority to investigate and prevent actions that harmed innocent populations. Third, technology sharing agreements that ensured critical systems would remain under cooperative control rather than being dominated by any single species. Never again would one civilization be able to hold the galaxy hostage through technological dependence. The Council vote on humanity's return was very different from their expulsion. This time, the margin was 1,247 votes in favor and only 12 against. Even Chancellor Krexelon of the Hegemony voted to support humanity's return after human medical teams had saved his daughter's life during the crisis. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty as it approached Nexus Station for the second time in less than a month. This time, however, he was not leaving in exile. He was returning as part of a humanity that had earned its place through competence, compassion, and moral courage. Dr. Danny Rodriguez joined him at the viewport. Captain, we could have left them to solve their own problems. After the way they treated us, no one would have blamed us. Captain Morrison smiled as he watched the space around Nexus Station, now bustling with human and alien ships working together to repair the damage. We left silently when they asked us to go, and we returned quietly when they needed us. That's not weakness, Danny. That's strength. The council chambers were very different when Ambassador Carter took her seat at the expanded High Council table. The humans had not conquered the galaxy through force or cunning. They had earned their place by showing that true civilization was measured not by technological advancement or military power, but by the willingness to help others even when you had been wrong. As the new Galactic Ethics Committee held its first meeting, with Dr. Amy Watson as its first human representative, the assembled species began to understand what they had almost lost. Humanity had not just provided technology to the galaxy. They had provided something far more valuable, the example of what it meant to do the right thing simply because it was right. The crisis that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization became the foundation for a stronger and more just society, one where the measure of a species was not their age or power, but their willingness to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves.